and we are honored tonight to have Chuck Collins here to share his ideas. Chuck is Senior Scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he directs the program on inequality and common good through the satellite office in Boston. He tirelessly speaks and writes about economic inequality in the U.S. He has done TED Talks and speaks nationally. He has written several books, including Wealth and Our Commonwealth, Why America Should Tax Accumulated Wealth with Bill Gates Sr., Born on Third Base, Is Inequality in America Irreversible, and several others. So you're not here to listen to me, so I'm going to turn it over to Chuck right now.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. All right, well, thank you for coming out. I should say I have a strong Door County connection. My dad grew up spending summers in Ephraim, and his father was an American composer named Edward Collins who lived in Chicago and taught at the Conservatory of Music. And the family lore is that I was conceived in Fish Creek. And I'm happy to report I don't know any more details than that. But I want to thank Jim Black and Michael Brudd, who really helped produce this event, and there's a wonderful team of people who made this event happen, so thank you to them. And I'm here to talk to you about a pretty serious matter, which is the moment we're living in, this kind of period of extraordinary inequality of income and wealth and opportunity. And I think that the discussion about that is somewhat stuck, meaning I think people sort of, unfortunately kind of have their mind made up sometimes talking about it, and I hope to offer a slightly different way of thinking about it, in part because I actually grew up, when you think about 99 to 1 and inequality, I grew up in the 1%, and the connection is my composer grandfather married Frida Meyer, the oldest daughter of the meatpacker Oscar Meyer. So that's the Madison connection, and some of you know that amazing history. And the plant that just closed last summer, sadly. When I was 21, the company went from a family business, sold to General Foods, which was then bought by Kraft, which was then bought by Philip Morris, which then divested Kraft. And so it hasn't been a family enterprise for decades, but that sale, triggered a flow of wealth that I was a beneficiary of. So that's where I like to say I was born on third base or won the lottery at birth because of that connection. And there's still family members in the Madison area who are involved in management and who led the building of that amazing enterprise that I am in touch with. And but I should say that I've never driven a Wienermobile. I have sat in the driver's seat, but you need to have a special license to take that out on the road. So, and I essentially grew up in the Detroit suburbs, in a suburb, Bloomfield Hills, which is a kind of a wealthy enclave outside of Detroit. I went to Cranbrook School, which is a boys' school. The school motto is "Aim High," which is depicted by an archer shooting an arrow straight up into the air, which if you think about it. So I could have probably sort of comfortably resided in that bubble for a long time, except for a couple things. One was when I was 7, that was the year of the Detroit riots, the uprising in Detroit, and I was pestering my parents to tell me what's going on, why is this happening? And my kind of fair-minded mother from rural Ohio said, this has to do with things are not fair in this city. And I sort of took that to mean the gap between where we lived in Bloomfield Hills and inner city Detroit, which I was just starting to understand, going back and forth to Tiger Stadium and where my dad worked, but also the divide between black and white in that context, and rich and poor. So that's planted a seed in my life, which, as a teenager and later, I really became very attuned to these inequalities that sort of going back and forth across many contexts. And when I was in my mid-20s, I had an amazing job working with mobile home park tenants, people who own their home but not the land under their homes, to work to buy their parks and own them as kind of resident-owned cooperatives. And I did that work all over New England. And in the process of that, mid-1980s, I had this intimate front row seat to how people were surviving as real wages started to flatten out and in some cases fall for most workers in the region. And as we know, after World War II, there really was this kind of extraordinary period of shared economic growth. The rising tide did lift most boats. The top fifth went up at the same rate as the bottom fifth and the middle fifth, whereas starting in the late 70s, real wages started to flatten and plateau and in some cases go down. And so I remember, I was sort of knew these folks' intimate financial private information because I was the one who was saying, what's your savings, what's your income, what can you afford to pay toward the purchase of the park? And in Born and Third Base, I tell the story of one particular mobile home park that didn't have enough money initially in my analysis to purchase their park, but sort of came together, pulled every nickel that they had out of their pocket. Unbeknownst to each other, the leadership group put every dollar they had on the table because I was, of course, the only one who knew what people's individual financial circumstances. So I watched an act of extraordinary solidarity among these residents, and it completely kind of rewired me. All I can say is I'd never, growing up in a affluent community with a lot of go-getter business leaders, I'd been around people who were generous and charitable, but I'd never experienced solidarity, and it really had an impact on me. So that was one piece of the front row seat I had to inequality, but the other was coming from a family that had a lot of wealth. And when I turned 21, I was given a trust fund to pay for my own education, when I wrote checks and went to college. 6 years later, that pile of wealth doubled, as best as I can tell, through no effort of mine. And so I saw the other intimate front row seat, which was money multiplying. And it was among my friends and family and others who were essentially saying, we bought that house for X and we just sold it for 50X, or we are invested in this fund and it's getting a 38% or 28% return. And so I was also privy to wealth multiplying at the same time that wages were falling. I remember some of the mobile home residents were working more jobs, taking on more family members working, taking on debt. I remember sitting at a kitchen table with a woman who, kind of her eyes teared up as she, with shame, explained that she was going to have to get a credit card in order to pay for her car repair so she could get to work. And this thrifty Yankee woman who had never thought of borrowing in her life had to cross that line for herself. So that was the experience I had in my mid-20s. And now, fast forward to today. What's the picture? Well, unfortunately, that flat wage picture has remained pretty much the case. There's been a little bump up in median income in the last couple years, but for almost half the population, real wages have pretty much stayed constant to what they were before the internet age. Meaning even in this period, the last 40 years of this extraordinary updraft of wealth, of technology, of affluence, half the population has not really shared in the productivity gains and has had to figure out how to manage their lives without that. That single fact, I think, tells us a lot about the moment that we're in. Because I think a polarized economy gives rise to a breakdown in civic life and a polarization of politics. But another piece of that picture is the less visible part, which is the fact that most of the income and wealth gains, and certainly most of the lion's share since the economic meltdown 10 years ago, have gone not to the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. Households with wealth over 30 million. have seen their assets and wealth expand enormously. And the higher up we go up that economic ladder, the more concentrated wealth has become. The Forbes 400 billionaires, on the Forbes list, combined net worth is equal to the combined net worth of the bottom 64% of US households. Now you might be thinking, how is that possible, or did you just make that up? But part of the reason for that is that 1 out of 5 households has 0 or negative net worth. And if you look at through the lens of race, 30% of US households have 0, black households have 0 or negative wealth, 27% of Latino households. So the ranks of underwater nation are rising. And the higher up the economic ladder we go, the more we enter what I call the dynastic wealth zone. And this is a fact that has not been published yet, so you're the first to hear it, but we are doing a report that we do every year. The three wealthiest dynastic wealth families in this country, the Waltons of Walmart, the Mars family, the Mars Candy dynasty, if you will, in its 4th generation, and the Koch brothers, their wealth together. We looked at, in 1982, what their family net worth was. We updated it in 2018 dollars and looked at it today. And since 1982, those 3 families' combined wealth has increased 6,000%. Now, in the United States, there's a fair amount of examples of great fortunes that rise up and then are dispersed over generations. From shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations is the famous saying. But there are families that focus on how do they arrest that process? How do they preserve those dynasties for generations ahead? And those are families that aggressively engage in what I would call dynasty preservation work, meaning they hire a lot of attorneys, tax attorneys, wealth managers, and trust lawyers to figure out how to remove as much wealth as possible from oversight and taxation and hold it. So that's the picture. And what I would say is that these inequalities now are kind of baked into the rules of the economy, meaning that even if today we were to say, well, let's all resolve to sort of try to organize the economy to grow together as opposed to pull apart, that we're sort of on a kind of an autopilot. Wages will continue to stay pretty flat. They might go up just because unemployment is so low, but wealth is going to continue to pool and concentrate at the very, very top. And the French economist Thomas Piketty warned that we are moving toward becoming a patrimonial society, patrimonial capitalism, where the sons and daughters of today's billionaires will dominate our future culture, politics, philanthropy, and economy. I have a fun quote for the day. Oh, I think I left it over there. But basically, there was a quote in the paper yesterday from somebody who said, "We are now living in a new plutocratic era." And the person who said that is not your normal, it was Paul Volcker, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, who was sounding the alarm about these trends. So if we don't intervene in the sort of machinery that's generating these inequalities, we're essentially moving toward a kind of racial and economic apartheid society. What's interesting about that, from my perspective, is that that is not actually in anyone's interest. It is not, we do not want to go down that road. We do not want to become like Brazil, where there's an imploding middle class, where the wealthy elites live behind walls and drive their bulletproof Mercedes-Benz from their enclave residential area to their enclave shopping area and measure your status by how many bodyguards your children go to school with. That is not where anyone wants to go. Most of the people I know who are from my background, my fellow one percenters, understand that we don't want our children and grandchildren to grow up in sort of a economic apartheid society. And now there is a mountain of research showing that these extreme inequalities undermine pretty much everything we care about. And there's a robust debate or conversation about, there has been for 30 years about, okay, does how much wealth the wealthy have really matter, or should we be concerned about that? We should be obviously concerned about the floor, poverty, persistent poverty. How do people, hold it together? How do we lift people out of poverty, break cycles, et cetera? But does it really matter what's happening at the top? And what this new mountain of research over the last decade shows is actually the gap itself matters a lot. Not just the poverty, but the concentration of wealth and power have all kinds of negative effects on the society. And I won't go into enormous detail except to say a couple examples. Democracy, well, that one's kind of easy. The more concentrated wealth there is, the more concentrated power is, the power to shape the conversation, shape the media, shape the political outcomes. These inequalities are effectively disenfranchising you. They are taking away our voice, diminishing our power in the national, particularly the national, but more and more in state and local conversations. So too much inequality is bad for the functioning of democratic institutions. Very similar to a century ago. In fact, a century ago, during the first Gilded Age, the main conversation was, can a fragile, self-governing republic survive these concentrations of wealth and power? Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis, before he was a Supreme Court Justice, said, we can have concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have democracy, but we cannot have both. That was the tenor of that debate, and it led to a number of reforms that we can talk about. So, bad for democracy. There's growing evidence that shows it's actually bad for the economy. It's bad for the functioning of a healthy free market economy to have so much consumption power and economic power in few hands. It leads to a decline in aggregate demand, spending power by the bottom half or 60% of the population. It creates more and more indebtedness cycles. So you have $1.4 trillion in college student debt that didn't exist a generation ago. It leads to volatility and market swings. It's bad for healthy economic life. And what's fascinating is to see now a whole generation of both current and retired business leaders stepping forward to talk about this. You don't have to take it from me. You can listen to Peter Georgescu, who's the retired CEO of Young and Rubicon, big Madison Avenue ad agency, who is friends and has lunch at the Four Seasons every week with his friends like Ken Langone, the angel investor who started Home Depot, and other CEOs, and Larry Fink from Blackstone. These are his friends. And he's talking to them about these inequalities. This is the conversation happening in their private discussions. And he says, many of them, I talk about these inequalities and they're alarmed. They're concerned about what's happening to their workforce. They're concerned about the future of democracy. Some of them raised the question, well, Peter, this may be bad, but won't the medicine be worse? Wouldn't we have unintended consequences? What if you're talking about policies like raising wages or taxing high-end incomes and wealth, won't that kill the goose that laid the American prosperity egg? And what Peter says to them is, actually, these inequalities are poisoning the goose. And he has a whole new audience of people talking about that. Social mobility. We have a self-identity story as people from the United States. We are a socially mobile society. It doesn't matter where you're born. What matters is the hard work that you do, the choices you make. You can move from the bottom fifth to the middle. You can move from the middle to the top. Some of you can move from the bottom to the top. We have social mobility. Unfortunately, that is an old story. It's kind of like I haven't looked in the mirror for 30 years, and I'm like, my hair is still brown, right? It's an old story. It was the story of the post-World War II social mobility, which was extraordinary from a planetary point of view. But today, if you are not born in the top fifth and you want the American dream, let's define that. Own a home, take a paid vacation, retire before you die, leave something for your children. If you want that American dream and you're not born in the top fifth, you are better off living in Canada. You are better off living in a number of other industrialized countries that still make the kinds of investments in early childhood education and opportunity that allow non-wealthy people to have a shot. But unfortunately, these inequalities are impeding social mobility. I won't go on and on, but trust me, there's a lot of research looking at sports, culture, community life, civic life, public health, your personal health. All the things we care about, really, are undermined by these inequalities. So, how many of you here were here for the previous presentation a couple weeks ago? Okay, so you'll be happy to know I have no slides. In fact, I'm done with the data portion of the program, right? Some people here, got the picture. So the question is, what do we do about this? How do we reverse these inequalities? Well, first, we should look at our own U.S. experience. We did actually have that period from 1945 to the mid-70s where we had a relatively shared prosperity economy. We did some things that are still relevant. We invested in education. Millions of people became the first person in their family to go to college. We invested in first-time homebuyer loan programs. I have an uncle from my mother's side of the family who bought his farm outside Lima, Ohio, with a 40-year, 1% fixed-rate mortgage from Farmers Home Administration. And he and some 14 million other people, households, got on the wealth-building express train thanks to public investments in education, affordable housing, first-time homebuyer loan programs, Veterans Administration, FHA mortgages, and the like. We had a much more progressive tax system, and we invested in infrastructure. Some of you have maybe heard Bernie Sanders I actually worked with Bernie Sanders back in the 80s when he was the mayor of Burlington, Vermont. I can attest he's been saying the same thing for 35 years. So I will now relay to you. He says, under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, the wealthiest 1% paid twice as much in income tax, 3 times as much in inheritance tax, and it was invested in free college, first-time homebuyer loan programs, infrastructure that created a generation of prosperity. Right. Looking again. So, Bernie's been saying the same thing. That doesn't mean he's wrong. He's right. We actually had a much more progressive tax system, and we did. So we know something about what do we need to do, what are the components of wiring an economy that grows together. Tremendous focus on building businesses and enterprises, support for the infrastructure that was a platform on which a lot of private enterprises and enterprises were built. So that's one thing. The other thing we should look at is what do we have to learn? What do we have to learn from other countries? Oh my God. Can we learn anything from countries, other robust industrial economies that have less inequality? And again, I think it's worth looking at the Nordic model, what I call the Nordic model, which has been maligned, and I don't mean to romanticize it in any way, but it's been maligned as a welfare state. But as somebody who's spent some time there, what I've noticed is it's a pro-work state. They're really interested in, like, let's get people into the workforce so they can pay these taxes, you know? And so what is it that we could learn from them? Well, one thing is that they have a much higher safety net and floor, what I would call a decency floor, meaning that there is a wage floor, there is a universal health insurance. There's early intervention for learning disabilities. There's universal pre-K, and there's debt-free college. You know, these are all things that, but I mean, I should say as a floor, the floor is, means that people don't walk around saying, oh my God, if I lose my job, if I lose my health, if I lose my marriage, I won't become destitute. And that's something that a lot of people in our society walk around with. In fact, I think we underestimate how fundamentally insecure many people feel knowing that they could fall all the way to living in their car until their car gets repossessed or whatever, you know. That is a big deal. And the Nordic countries, just when they look at our economic model, they're like, well, okay, I understand, you know, you have vibrant free market capitalism, but you can still have a higher decency floor than we have. The other thing is that they invest in social mobility and in opportunity. They have a lifelong learning. If you lose your job, you can get a stipend and go back and get job retraining. You didn't miss your chance in life if you're 20, 40, 50. The society reinvests back in you, and you get back into the workforce so you can pay those taxes. And so they have the investments that enable people to advance to whatever level they work toward. And the other thing is that they put some limits on the concentration of wealth and power. They have a progressive tax system. But among the wealthy people I interviewed, they were like, yeah, we grumble about taxes, but they know their kid is going to college for free. They know that they're not worrying about their parents' long-term health care canard. They know that their neighbors are not destitute and living in fear. They know that there is a decency level. To me, we could learn something from that. We could learn from that, and fascinatingly, the rate of entrepreneurship in those countries is higher per capita than the United States. Why would that be? Because I think to take a leap and risk that many entrepreneurs take, it helps to have somewhat of a net. And in this society, that's a family net, a born on third base or born on second base family social safety net. But more people can take leaps in those other countries. And if some of you are bookish, I recommend 3 really interesting books. One is called The Nordic Theory of Everything. Another one's called A Year of Living Danishly. And Viking Economics by George Lakey. Just because I think part of we're suffering from some vision constraint here and misinformation. Fascinating. I was I had an opportunity to travel in Denmark and stay with a family, and my Danish, I call my Danish mother, was visiting the United States, and I was like, wow, you've solved so many of the problems that I wish we could solve. What's the work now? You know, what's the work in improving a society? And she said, the work now is healing from the multi-generational legacies of trauma. Right. Because people don't show up at the same place. Well, why is that? We are so busy re-traumatizing people or traumatizing people today, or a generation of children that's living in some of our communities. We're not at the point where we can start to look at cleaning up the multi-generational legacy. I'd like to get to that point. I'd like to live in communities where now we say, okay, everybody's sort of basically okay here, surviving. Nobody's living on the street. Nobody's living in their car. Now, who's showing up here with multi-generational trauma? Let's work on that. So what do we can learn? We know that there are policies that lift the floor, and there are policies that create opportunity, and we know that there's things that we probably need to do to protect our democracy from the influence of money and power and campaign finance reform, or things that we can do to reduce the impact of money. And least popular of all, we need to address this concentration of wealth and power, which continues to upend any other advances we try to make. Meaning we can't just fix it by lifting the floor and leveling the playing field, because what we're noticing is the concentrated wealth and power does not just sit there. It has a disruptive impact. I could say more about that. So what can we do? At the federal level right now, it's called try to minimize harm. So we just passed this tax cut at the end of last year that's kind of like throwing oil on the inequality fire. We could make the argument that we as a society spend $600 billion on wealth building subsidies, the home mortgage interest deduction, retirement funds, and other savings tax breaks, that $600 billion a year to help individuals grow wealth, most of which goes to the top 10% of households. So we could say, well, that's kind of upside down. What if we took the home mortgage, the amount of money that we subsidize home ownership, and direct it toward people who don't own homes yet, because our national home ownership rate is steadily going down? What if we incubated? Maybe we can't get anything in the short term, but what if we started to incubate some big ideas? Things that would help us expand our imagination of what's possible. For instance, what if we said, hey, anybody who does 2 years of national service, military, civilian, community service, do 2 years, protect the homeland, help with hurricane relief, clear trails, help teachers. You do 2 years, you get a debt-free college education. Paid for, by the way, by a surcharge in tax on wealth over 50 million. What do we do with something like, what does something like that accomplish? First, it expands opportunity. Secondly, maybe it helps reweave the broken social fabric that exists. Third, it reduces the concentration of wealth. Let's start to incubate ideas like that. In California, the students of California are putting a ballot initiative forward to tax inheritances on estates over 10 million or 20 million, and funding low-cost higher education, trying to bring back the glory days of California's best public education system, higher education system in the country. Those things actually are wildly popular. These proposals are wildly popular. And the good news is it may not look like it, but there's actually sort of a realignment. People are waking up to the fact that these inequalities are undermining the common good and want to do something about it. But my experience is that not everybody is alarmed. And that part of what's going on is that we have powerful stories that hold these inequalities in place, that justify these inequalities. And if you have for instance, the statistics that I mentioned to you, some of those are pretty powerful, but some of my friends hear those statistics and say, it's troubling, but the people at the high end have worked hard and have added value to the society. They are job creators, and we really don't want to tinker with that. And the corollary to that is, the people who are not doing so well are probably making bad choices. They have a powerful story that essentially justifies these extreme inequalities. Now, I could point out, these are not inequality based on differences in effort or deservedness. There are inequalities as a result, but these are systemic driven inequalities. But people have powerful stories that explain that. For instance, some of you may have heard that the oil billionaire J. Paul Getty was asked, how do you become wealthy in America? And he said, it's really simple. There's 3 things you have to do. We can do a little poll here. 1, get up early in the morning. Who got up early this morning? I did. Okay, good. 2, work hard all day, including going to a lecture in the evening. 3, find oil. Guess we're not in Texas, are we? So people hear these statistics about inequality and they say, well, some people get up early, work harder, invent a better mousetrap, take risks, make better choices. And those other people, the opposite. So if you have that story, it doesn't matter how long my PowerPoint presentation is, because it's not going to change your story. Well, have you ever had a conversation with anybody that sort of gets stuck right there? How do we change the stories that hold these inequalities in place? How do we change what I call the narrative of deservedness? In fact, if I were going to put it on a bumper sticker, it's everyone is where they deserve to be. Right? But if that's your worldview, if that's like your bumper sticker story of the universe, what do we do? Well, I got a clue as to how to change that story or disrupt that narrative, if you will, when I was working to defend the inheritance tax, the estate tax. Back when George W. Bush was elected, he ran on end the death tax. And around that time, I was putting a coalition together, and I got this call from a coworker said, Bill Gates is on the phone. And I was like, yeah, right, But it was Bill Gates' father, the founder of Microsoft. He said, I understand you're organizing wealthy people in defense of the estate tax. He says, I want to help. I'm like, great. He says, how can I help? So, we wrote a book together. We went and lobbied Congress. We organized other high net worth individuals. We got 1,500 multimillionaires and billionaires to sign a public petition saying, don't abolish the estate tax. It's an all-American tax. It's a good thing. It raises substantial revenue from those most able to pay. It encourages charitable giving, and it puts a brake on the concentration of wealth and power. That was our rap. So we did these press conferences around the country, and some of these 1,500 people would come out and speak. And at one of these press conferences, this guy Martin got up and he says, I'm a software engineer. I'm going to pay the estate tax someday. Let me tell you why I think I should pay an estate tax. And this is what Martin says. He says, I was born in a family that had no money, working class family. My parents worked my entire childhood, never took a vacation. He says, but I went to a pretty good elementary school, and I went to a great high school, and I had these science teachers that just lit my imagination on fire. And there was a public library that was walking distance from my house, that was open till 9 o'clock every night and open on the weekends. A library where there was this librarian. Every time I came in, she said, Martin. I'm like, I can't even remember her name, but she said, Martin, I have a book for you. She knew I was interested in science. It was a biography of a scientist. Martin says, one time it was a book on experiments you can do in your apartment without burning it down. Martin says, my family had no money, but I had a good education. Someone else paid for my education. Someone else paid for that library to be open. And then I went to college, and I got a free ride through the state university system. Someone else made it possible for me to go to college. And then I went into the emerging field of technology. I got a teaching fellowship. I was learning about the internet. I started my own company. Where did I hire my workers? I went to the public university computer science lab and I hired the workers. Someone else paid to train my workers in the foundation of knowledge they would need to work for me. And then a company, a foreign corporation, stole my patents. It was going to put me out of business. And the United States government went to an international tribunal and defended my intellectual property and won, saving my business. Martin says, I didn't even know this arm of government existed, let alone I didn't do anything to pay for it. And so Martin says, so last year I sold my company for $30 million. I have 2 other companies valued at the same amount. But if you abolish this tax, what you're basically saying is I have no responsibility to pay back the society that made it almost entirely possible for me to get where I am. At this point in the press conference, he literally is pounding the podium. He says, I have a moral obligation to pay back so that some other kid out there, born in the same humble circumstances as I, have the same opportunities to climb and make their lives good. Because what a good society does is it recognizes no one does it alone. If you have 10 million or 20 million or 50 million or 50 billion like Mr. Gates over here or his son, if you have that kind of wealth, you didn't do it alone. You may have worked hard. You may have applied yourself uniquely. You may have exceptional gifts, but you're operating in a fertile soil that together we build. And so if you abolish this tax, you're saying, I can just walk away, pull up the ladder, never look back, enjoy my wealth, give it all to my kids. That's not the kind of America I want to live in. That's what he said. So, everybody's like, okay. How often do you hear that story? Good news. I hear that story all the time now. That's why I wrote Born on Third Base, because the counter to the narrative of I did it alone is individuals matter, right? We don't want to get over carried away here. Individual effort matters. Individual entrepreneurship, genius, talent matters and should be celebrated. But so should we celebrate the foundation, the fertile ground, the web that we create. And that there's no shame in admitting help. As much as our culture shames people for needing help, that's, as Martin says, is what a good society does. And I actually think part of what we deal with today, and I think I have to say, it's kind of a male construct, this idea of like, I did it alone. Like, really? You were born in a state of nature, raised by wolves? Did you have a mother? Did you have a teacher? Did you have a coach? Did you have public investments? How did this happen? You know, our president says he's a self-made billionaire who got a $1 million loan from his dad and paid it back with interest. Okay, so now we know there was a little exaggeration there. $400 million of help, at least. Or be like, you know, Brett Kavanaugh. He and I went to like the same school, and he busted his tail to get into Yale, except his grandfather went there. That didn't help. You know, that didn't hurt to be a legacy admission. Like, why is it that we construct these narratives of, I did it alone? Particularly us guys. Why do we insist on only looking back at our individual actions and not see this web that made things possible? And I think it's because if you admit that you got help to get where you are, then you're sort of responsible for ensuring that the investments should be there for others. But if you have amnesia or whatever, and you just think about anybody can do what I did, then you don't have to do that, because it's really about personality, character, choice, right? Maybe good genes. Some of that starts to drift into a little bit of yucky stuff. So the good news is there's a lot of people actively disrupting the narrative. In California, we have multimillionaires standing up and saying, hey, I went to University of California at Berkeley. I got a debt-free undergrad and graduate education. In fact, I graduated with money in the bank, and I went on and did these great things. And why can't we do it again for the next generation? And that's a really important part of our campaign. So let me just close with a couple of thoughts, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts, reactions. Comments are good, challenges are great. Tell me what I'm missing, because that's how I learn from these programs. But I've had these chances to talk to lots of wide-ranging groups, including some, sort of very thoughtful philanthropists, wealthy individuals. And what I've learned from them is the message to my people, the message to my fellow one percenters is, it's time to come home. That these inequalities matter enormously, and we need all hands on deck. Come home and commit yourself to a place. Not an enclave, but a region. And commit to make this region as great for everyone's children as it is for our children. To my fellow one percenters, I say, bring the wealth home. Bring it out of the shadows of the offshore tax system. Bring it out of the global financial casino, which is mostly predatory, and bring it back to the real economy of goods and services, the businesses and enterprises that we can touch and taste and feel that create real health and value for our communities. Take it out of the fossil fuel sector, which is using its power and clout to bring us to the brink, and invest in the new energy economy and the economy of the future. Tell true stories. This is, again, my invitation to my fellow one percenters. Tell people how Advantage works. Talk about help. Talk about the government loan. Talk about the family help. Demystify it. Doesn't diminish your own talent and effort. It just helps provide the nuanced picture that we need to understand and move forward. Tell true stories. Share the wealth. Share it as much as you can. But remember that philanthropy does amazing work, but it is not a substitute for a fair tax system and an adequately funded local, state, and federal government. Philanthropy is not a substitute. It is a complement. It is not in place of. Understand that philanthropy is subsidized by everyone else. That for every dollar a billionaire gives to his or her favorite charity, we, the taxpayers, chip in anywhere from 45 to 55 cents in lost tax revenue. So we, the public, has an interest in what you do, and you have a responsibility to the public. If you want to give your money away and not take a tax break, that's another story. So that's and I think we need people in the 1%, my people, I invite them to talk about taxes. Talk about what used to be paid, what's paid now, and why we should defend and preserve our fair tax system. My message to everyone else is it's time to come together and organize and defend our communities, defend Door County, defend northern Wisconsin from the sort of most dangerous aspects of what I would call extractive capitalism, the sort of way in which the financial economy is now preying on the healthy real economy. We need to defend our communities, defend low-wage workers, defend our neighbors. We need to come together and protect what is vital, protect our commonwealth from looting, organize to stop some of the policies that are moving forward. And I think in the process of that, I ask people in the bottom 90% to remember there are potential allies in the 1%. There are people who, behind the scenes often, are working to build a fair economy. There are obviously people who use their wealth and power to get more wealth and power, to rig the economy to get more wealth and power. But they are not the majority. They're just a well-organized, hyper effective little cabal. But they are not the majority of what I call people in the 1%. In fact, I think my experience is there are people working, and there are many more people who just are waiting to be invited to something bigger than consumption, something more meaningful. And this is the moment where we need to come together. How do I know this? I have one closing story. So I was talking at a church in suburban Los Angeles, wealthy congregation, Episcopal church. I talked about inequality. I think I said something like, there's some companies that pay their CEOs more than they pay in taxes, like Boeing and General Electric. So after this talk, I'm chit-chatting with people. People are pretty much leaving, and there's one older gentleman waiting to talk to me. And finally, he comes up to me, and it's just he and I, and he's probably a 6'5", silver-haired, handsome guy. And he says, my name is Hank. I just want to talk to you. I was the number 3 guy at Boeing for many years. Yeah, I thought, uh-oh. He says, I'm so embarrassed my company took so much from the taxpayers of this country and paid back so little. But that's not why I want to talk to you. He says, I have a question for you, but first I should just give you a little context. I've been retired from Boeing for a while, and I'm very active in church mission work. I used to be an engineer. I was trained as an engineer, and so I get a total kick out of working around the world, helping rural villages create little water treatment and water facilities and getting access to clean water. He says, I was in Kenya with a group of my church volunteer group, and we were working on this little well project. And every afternoon, these kids came to sit under a shade tree and watch us like we were the best entertainment. And so I got to know these kids, and they got to know me, and they called me Uncle Hank. And one day I just said, so where do you kids live? And they said, oh, come with us, Uncle Hank. And they took him by the hand, and they walked down this path, and they went over this little bridge, and they came to a kind of a building about the size of this room, kind of a one-story wooden, sort of tired structure that said orphanage. And Hank looks at these kids, and he looks, and they are well taken care of. They look cared for. And the kids are like, would you like to meet our adults? And he's like, sure. So he meets the director and some of the adults there. And Hank says to me, so I go home that night to my first world hotel and lie awake all night long thinking about these kids. And the next day they're there, and the next day they're there. And finally, at the end of my time there, I go to talk to the director of the orphanage. And I said, so is there anything I can do to help your orphanage? And the director says, well, sir, as you can see, our building is quite old. We could use some help to kind of fix it up. And we're really only able to help about 1/3 of the children that need our help. And Hank says, oh, what happens to the other 2/3? And the director says, oh, I don't want to trouble you, sir. And Hank says, well, you can trouble me. And the director says, well, we really lose track of them. Many of them migrate into the cities, and some of them are sold into slavery. Oh. Hank goes back to his wealthy Los Angeles congregation. He is a man on a mission. He organizes several delegations. They raise millions of dollars. They build new buildings. But Hank says, in the process of that, I had my heart cracked open. Those children cracked open my heart. He says, I worked inside of a company with people of the greatest integrity, people you would want on any team to solve any problem. He says, I don't ever remember us talking about poverty and inequality. Not because we were, but we had a story that explained the world. What happened to me in Kenya is that I could not come up with a story that would justify the gap between my good fortune and these children. And therefore, the only thing that could happen in that situation was for me to either completely go numb or to have my heart cracked open. Now, I went there and I've come back, and now I'm involved in inequality organizing work in greater Los Angeles. I'm involved in helping deal with all kinds of issues, the food system and the housing, and you know, I don't have to go around the world to have my heart cracked open. So Hank sort of looks at me and says, so my question is, and I'm kind of like, oh, right, he has a question. I'm like, why do I? So my question is it too late for me to make a difference? I said, no, I don't think so. I think you're doing exactly the right thing. You are bringing all your gifts to the moment. I said, we could use a few more like you, though. He says, oh, I'm working on that. Some of these guys are hard cases. I have to take them somewhere far away to have their heart cracked open because they're so wedded to their story of the world. But once that happens, once they meet these children, they are defenseless. And he says, what I've realized is I'm actually saving their lives. You see, my wife said to me, Hank, you remind me a lot of the guy I fell in love with when I was 23. Oh. And my children say, Dad, you seem like you're 20 years younger. Yeah. You seem more alive. He says, it's about being alive and doing what you can. I says, okay. So I've met a lot of Hanks in the last couple of years. I've met a lot of Hannahs. I've met a lot of people who are nurses and working class folks who are stepping up to try to do something on these issues of inequality. And what I ask, my last thought about my people is that privilege, advantage, is a disconnection drug. It keeps us from depending on one another. It keeps us in that false story of independence. And so it's actually in all of our interests to break through. So if privilege is a disconnection drug, the antidote is connection. Invite people home. Invite people who are isolated and think that they are alone and independent to participate in the life of a vibrant community of exchange. Invite people to the suffering and the joy of being alive in a human community. And so with that, I'll say it's not too late. We can change the stories that hold inequality in place. We can change the trajectory, but part of the work is the work of the heart. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you very much, Sherry.
Thanks for listening.
All right, we've got hands around. Just ask that you keep the mic close to your mouth so we can pick up what you're saying. Thank you so much. Very grateful.
Thank you.
Now I can stop eating all those food. I want to ask. To me, it seems we're having our democracy deconstructed. Okay, I'm seeing the international business taking root, and has nothing to do with allegiances.
Right.
And you've explained some of that, but how can there be such myopic vision as to not realize there's not going to be anybody left to buy anything?
Right, yeah. So the question was sort of like, she sees how international business with no allegiance to place is happening, but don't they sort of see that it's not that, if we keep, this is my words, if we keep eating our seed corn, there won't be anything left, kind of. No, I think that's part of it is part of this, it's a symptom of this story of supreme disconnection, right? So we're disconnected from ourselves, we're disconnected from one another, we're disconnected from nature. We're kind of then you can live with a story that says somehow this sort of global capital moving around at the rate that it is actually creating something of lasting worth and value. And I think this is where place matters. Door County matters. Greater Green Bay matters as thinking about a place where we can wrap our arms around a place and say, how do we protect it from these kind of destructive forces? It's not easy, but it's sort of like, think of it like we're getting ready for a big wind and you want to nail down as much of what's valuable as possible. Land, housing, affordable housing, the Commonwealth, the agricultural and food creating capacity of this region. You live in the Great Lakes, you are blessed in a way that other places on earth are not. Defend that commons to your death. Protect the land and livelihoods of people who live here. And I think that's sort of so there's a place-based response to kind of the looting effect. That's all my one tiny little insight there. Yeah. So, yeah, you'll call on people there, Jim. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Wayne.
Hey, Wayne.
I have a question about corporations. You've talked a lot about people. I know corporations are made of people, and corporations have added a new layer of personification with Citizens United so that they can have louder voices. But I also think I understand that corporations have an unprecedented amount of cash in their accounts.
Right.
That is used in a similar way to people that you refer to preserve their wealth and their stability. So and let me blend this with a story when I've talked with some executives that have come out of their corporate life and retired early up here at 52 and said, Wayne, the oil industry can't afford the transition. Our economy won't survive. So I'm wondering, do you think with Citizens United giving more personage to corporations, that could that economy survive where corporations pay a fair share of taxes? Am I making sense?
Yeah.
Can we survive the transition? Now, you've talked about people, but these corporations, I think, probably have more money than us people. And in some ways, the Koch brothers are corporations.
Yeah,
Response?
Yeah, that's a really thoughtful question. And first of all, corporations are owned by people. I mean, the private, the wealth of the richest 0.1%, a large portion of that is in the form of ownership of public and private companies. That is, so ultimately it is individuals. The corporate form, and I'm really talking not here about small businesses, local businesses, but we're talking about, let's say, 1,000 global corporations that have extraordinary power and assets and market share, operate in their own world, really, with impunity, and are really writing the rules of the global economy. And so from a democratic point of view, the Citizens United decision is particularly alarming because it's another usurping of our power. But I think that, and it also allows people to act in a collectively unintelligent way, different than an individual, conscience and accountability. So, I realized I didn't talk enough about sort of corporate power and sort of how to address that. What I think we need to do is start with looking at the corporate chartering system, the ways in which we give power to allow these entities to exist, and particularly look at the states in the United States that put so little accountability, because we could raise the bar. We could say, look, if you're a global corporation above a certain level, you have to be chartered at the federal level. You have to have much higher levels of transparency because you're a global corporation. You have to say where in the world you pay taxes, where you don't. You have to disclose what you own and what your subsidiaries are doing. We could raise the bar in a way that creates a new framework of rules of which corporations operate, because corporations are just an entity. It's up to us, the people, to create the framework and the rules. And I think that's where we have given up our power. And Citizens United is just one way. How is it possible that 90% of Fortune 500 corporations are incorporated in Delaware, which is the premier secrecy jurisdiction? Guess if you know anyone in Delaware, you should just call them up and say, how do you live with this? How do you live with the fact that all the internet web sex trafficking sites are incorporated by Delaware corporations? How do you live with the fact that all these illicit funds and money laundering and criminal activities are run through Delaware incorporated corporations? You're like the crack house in the neighborhood that's bringing everything down. Wyoming, same. We should be putting great pressure on these states to rein in and create greater transparency with corporations. There's a lot more to talk about there, but maybe I'll stop there just to hear from more people. A pen? Oh, here, can I use that pen?
My name is Peter, and this is not quite a philosophical question. It's a little bit more practical. You've talked, and many people have talked about the 1/10 of 1%, the 1%, 10% to 20%. The Economist, the Atlantic, had an article about 2 months ago about who's in the 10%. Could you give a dollar figure? How much money do I have to earn annually to be 1/10 of 1%, 1%, 10%, 20%? And therefore, to what extent, how do I, and how do the other people in this room, how do we all participate in this economy of inequality?
That's a good question. I don't know those numbers off the top of my head. And I will actually make one slight commercial announcement here, which is I edit a newsletter called inequality.org and a website. And I send out a newsletter on Mondays that has all this kind of data and examples of what people are doing to respond to inequality. And we try to have a sense of humor, believe it or not, and hope, and all those good things. So while we're talking, I'm going to pass around a clipboard. If you want to check out this newsletter, I'll send it to you. It'll come from me. But here's my best guesstimate or memory. For you to be in the top 1/10 of 1%, this is as of today, I got this, you probably need to have about 30 million in assets and income over 4 million or something like that. To be in the 1%, you're at like 7.5, 8 million net worth, income, 1.5 million. To be in the top, so that's what I remember. I think that, and then here's another way to think about it, and I write about this in Born on Third Base, and this is from Robert Frank's book, Richistan. He sort of breaks it down into territories. He says there's lower Richistan. Actually, I would call it Affluentville, which is like the top 20%. The Atlantic Magazine article is really interesting, and I recommend it. It's called The Birth of a New American Aristocracy, the 9.9%. And Matthew Stewart's point is the bottom 90% has lost income and wealth share. The top 1/10 of 1% has gained pretty much what the bottom 90% lost. The 9.9% has held ground. And his point is that while they're not as wealthy and powerful as the top 1/10 of 1%, they're sort of like the enablers. They're Their class interest is more aligned with the very, very wealthy. They act and serve the interests of that group, and they are often the facilitators of that upward wealth trend. So he would argue, yes, the top 1/10 of 1% is kind of like the drivers of the boat, have enormous power. The next 9.9% are kind of like the deckhands, the agents, the lubricators, facilitators, enablers of that. And then, Richard Reeves wrote an interesting book last year called Dream Hoarders, which is really just focusing on what I would call the top 20% and saying, look at the ways in which, by helping our children, which is what parents do, we help our children, in a society where we're not investing in opportunity, we are privileging our children and kind of giving them advantages. It's like incumbency protection against the bottom 80%. So if we're going to focus on what sociologists call the intergenerational transmission of advantage, if we're just going to help our kids, unpaid summer internship, debt-free college, the car that they don't have to pay for, on and on and on and on. And as well as a lot of small little things, but that make a big difference. It's one thing to help your kids. It's another thing to do it at a time when all the other children in this society don't have comparable advantages. So we should think about how those dynamics play out. And in Born on Third Base, I talk about 4 21-year-olds that I coached in soccer in my Boston neighborhood, one of whom is going to have an oversized advantage just because she grew up in a family with some wealth and opportunity, and she's going to basically, her trajectory is she's going to stay up there. And the other 3 are kind of part of the precariat, what British sociologists call the precariat. That's the new class, the precarious class. So only one of them will have this kind of hedge against downward mobility thanks to the oversized role of family wealth. And not even a substantial wealth, just family advantage. So I think there's, in summary, I think all of this is useful as part of the conversation about inequality, just to understand the sort of what I would call the new physics of inequality, which is accelerating advantage at the top and compounding disadvantage for the bottom as much as 70%, and that there are different levels of cooperation with that. Anyway, so check out in Born on Third Base this sort of, and I do have, I'll actually do a little piece just on I'll put a piece up on inequality.org answering your question about what are the new thresholds. They keep changing every 2 years quickly. Used to not be so hard to get into the 1%. It's a little harder now. So it's really hard to get on the Forbes 400 now. It used to be with $75 million, you could be on the Forbes 400 in 1982. You could be in the wealthiest. $75 million could get you on that list. Now you need like $1.3 billion just to get on that top list. So.
Hi, my name is Barb, and I'm looking at this from a sociologist's point of view, and I'm watching this magnificent, beautiful, well-run country of ours become a third world country. And I say that because if you look at the third world countries, they have the rich and then everybody else is poor. And we're moving toward that. And I've been thinking for a long time that we have been losing our middle class. Our middle class is what holds everything together. If you have a large middle class, a small wealthy class, and a small poorer class, you will have a running economy.
Yeah.
Without us as the middle class, you absolutely lose the vibrancy of the entire system, because the middle class is the one who gives to the poor, makes sure the poor gets the things they need because they were there and they've moved out of it. And they'll let the rich have a few things because they're hoping someday they may go there or their kids will go there. But the imbalance at this point is, it's a firestorm.
Well said. Yeah, I think that, Thomas Piketty's, one of his insights, the French economist who looked at the United States and wrote this book, Capital, which some of you may actually own. Some of you may have actually read the first 40 pages. Apparently the online, version, pretty much most people got to about page 40 and didn't finish the other 600 pages. But so the short version is something about the wiring of unregulated capitalism, which just creates inequality. So if you want to have a society with a large and robust middle class, if we decide that's for the reasons you well said, you kind of have to rewire. And there is no other, it isn't going to be charitable institutions. It's not going to be the private sector. It's going to be we the people through the role of government. The big bad government is how we built a middle class after World War II. We consciously wired the economy to expand middle class opportunity primarily for white people. By the way, we should not omit this very important fact that we put millions and millions of people on the wealth building train with first-time homebuyer loans, debt-free college, the GI Bill for education, VA mortgages for housing. But because of discrimination in lending and discrimination in Jim Crow education systems, many people of color did not get on the express train they were sort of left standing at the station waiting for the train that never showed up. We should be so alarmed as a country that the home ownership rate, this idea that is in a steady decline. It has been since 2006 for whites and people of color, steadily going down. And that's one of those middle class indicators. The other one is, what do you have to fall back on in terms of savings? If you really sort of peel back, we have a large precariat. That middle 50% maybe is the precariat class. So it means that we have to talk to everybody we know and say, just as you opened that, said, we're heading toward a polarized Brazil-like situation. We either keep going that way and no one is going to like where we go, or we have to say government has to serve that interest, and we have to retake our democracy. And we can learn from our past, post-World War II, we can learn from other countries, and we can make that deal. One thing I'll just mention, I chair something called the Hidden Wealth Working Group. So even though because part of what's going to happen is you're going to say, well, we'd like to make these investments, and that you're going to be told there's no money. There's no money at the local level, there's no money in the state, there's no money at the federal level unless you're an arms manufacturer. There's no money. There's austerity. And we're going to see the rise of private philanthropy as private power. And we're seeing this in a lot of cities. So if you go to New Haven today, you'll see the nonprofit charitable sector investment. There's a building boom, hospitals, Yale, and then you cross the street and where the pothole and the bridge are falling down. You're going to see private abundance, private opulence, really, and public austerity. So are we broke? As a friend of mine runs a soup kitchen in Chicago, she says, we're not broke, we're just twisted, meaning in our priorities are our values. So what's happened? Well, part of what's happening is there's a huge amounts of wealth that's just vanishing from the equation. It's going into private trusts. It's going into offshore tax havens. It's going outside the reach of accountability and taxation. We estimate 10% of the world's wealth, trillions of dollars, is now vanished from. So even the levels of inequality that I'm talking about does not include the amount of wealth that's not attached to anyone's name. And that's a growing segment of wealth at the very, very top. And this is where, you know, there's a whole sector, I call it the wealth defense industry or the dynasty protection industry, that is using a range of professional skills to help this wealth manage. And it couldn't happen without them. Because who are you going to call in the Cayman Islands to move your money? Who are you going to call in Panama or the British Virgin Islands to wire your money to buy for your LLC incorporated in Delaware to buy your condo in Boston? So there's this huge amounts of wealth. So where is it? Is it actually in the Virgin Islands or in the British Virgin Islands? No, it's actually here. That wealth is here. It's held by non-disclosed entities. It's buying up huge amounts of Boston real estate. We have a luxury building boom. We have these towers rising across the city, hundreds of units coming online every month that are $6-7 million condos that no one's living in. They're high-end wealth storage units. They're just another asset class. And this is happening in all the coastal cities, maybe in Chicago, maybe you see some of the effects here. Actually, we were talking about who's buying all these condos in Door County. We don't know. That's part of the thing. So that's another challenge is, you know, where's the money? We need to push for transparency and to close down this sort of system of global hidden wealth. Now that sounds like a big task globally, but actually the United States could have a huge role in leading that transparency process. Cities, turns out, local jurisdictions can require higher levels of disclosure of property ownership. Cities could say, you have to say who the beneficial owner of this property is if you want to have legal rights in our local system. You want to sue the contractor that didn't finish the work, who's the real owner of this property? Disclose it on the deed. Boom. We don't have to wait for national government to do that. We could get local jurisdictions could have disclosure of beneficial ownership. So I just mentioned that there are some things we could start to do, even push back at the local level, that would have a global positive effect.
Aside from everything you've mentioned, what I've noticed traveling around the world and reading about other countries is that in third world countries, not only do you have so much of the wealth concentrated in one place, but then the water supply is privately owned for profit, education is privately owned for profit, now our prisons are privately owned for profit, more and more privately owned for profit institutions, which make it even more difficult for ordinary people to just get the least that they need to survive.
Really important point about, I would call it the global enclosure of the commons. You know, some of you know your English history, know about the closing of the common lands in England, you know, that feudal, you know, rural people lived, you know, they could hunt, they could gather, and the ecological commons is being grabbed, land, water, and the like. And the more concentrated power, the more corruption there is when it comes to defending the commonwealth. In fact, there isn't even a concept of commonwealth because it's all going to be private. And that's where, again, at the local level, you have this fabulous community land, you know, land trust. You have other institutions. You have a library this is the symbol, the emblem of the commons. Who owns this library? You do. The people of this community own it. So part of it is, like I said, nailing down, protecting, managing well the commons that exist. The lake, the Great Lakes are commons and need defenders and voices and advocates. But that, and we're kind of on the same, there's constant pressure on that boundary of where the commons is. Water, who owns water? Who owns the atmosphere? Who owns the internet? Big fights over this commons, this internet. So it's an important point.
Wrap it up pretty soon here because lights in the box.
Also, don't feel trapped back there if you need to leave. They put me up here because they thought maybe but there's a door you can get out the back too.
I didn't feel it's very dark here. So if you have more questions.
Oh, the lights are going to go off.
Just thought of something when you were talking about commons. Common spaces, public spaces for protesting is another place. My daughter lives in Minneapolis, and the reason they protested at the Mall of America is because we don't have green spaces in the middle of our little towns anymore where we can go and protest, where everybody comes to gather in communities, our malls and places like that, that aren't publicly owned, they're privately owned, and so we don't have places to protest against things. I just heard the other day now that the Parks Department in Washington, D.C. is going to be charging for protests, possibly now there. It's another, public space that we're not going to own really anymore for those kind of things.
Yeah. The proper emotional response to the looting of the commons is outrage, resistance, advocacy. That's the only way we can defend, and public space is a key ingredient of a democratic society. And congratulations to you for not only this library, but for this remarkable concert lawn over here and the other public spaces. Defending public space and making sure that it's well cared for, stewarded well, those are acts of grace, So, our democracy is obviously under siege, including the public spaces that allow us to assemble, to express ourselves. Like we're all just going to stay home and push buttons on our computers to resist what's about to happen. No, we're going to have to occupy public spaces.
So very good. Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you. Yeah.